Nadine Barlow had never even heard of Great Aunt Lucille until the day her mother took her aside and told her that the woman had passed on. She hadn't quite known how to react to the news. Now, standing at the gravesite under a slow, steady rain, she felt even more uncomfortable. 14 years old, Nadine had been lucky enough to have never lost anyone close to her. To her, death was something that happened only on TV, in the movies, or the people you didn't really know. Even now, as she watched the polished wooden coffin being lowered into the ground, she felt nothing special for the person inside it. Supposedly, Lucille was her mother's aunt, but since there had never been any contact between their families, she might as well have been from Mars as far as Nadine was concerned. As the minister stood over the grave and read several passages from the Bible, Nadine took the opportunity to scan the faces of the 30 or so other mourners at the gravesite. Many of the people appeared to be at least 50 years old. The only exceptions were her older sister Diane and two teenage boys who looked like they desperately wanted to be somewhere else. Nadine was definitely the youngest person there. She took pride in the fact that she was able to look just as sad and depressed as any of the adults, even if she was only putting on an act. As her eyes roamed over the rows of faces, some familiar, most not, Nadine noticed a tall, stern-looking man in his late 30s or early 40s. He wore a dark trench coat over an equally dark wool suit, the kind men in old movies wore. He didn't seem to be paying attention to the ceremony. In fact, he was staring directly at her, and it wasn't a friendly gaze. Creepy, Nadine thought, turning her eyes away from him. But even though she was no longer looking at the man, she continued to feel his gaze on her throughout the burial ceremony. After what seemed like an eternity, the service was finally over. Slowly, the guests said their goodbyes and headed back to their cars. Walking with her parents and older sister, Nadine glanced back several times to see what the mysterious stranger was up to. He was slowly walking toward the narrow road where all the mourners' cars were parked. He walked alone without a single person approaching him or even giving him a passing wave. And as he walked, his eyes remained fixed on Nadine. "Mom, who's that man looking at us?" she finally asked her mother, pointing to the man in the trench coat. Immediately, the stranger turned away, concealing his face. "I don't know," her mother said, peering through the misty fog that blanketed the cemetery. "He's probably a relative from out of town." Nadine piled into the car with the rest of her family, and as they pulled away, she turned and looked out the back window. The stranger was standing by the roadside, still staring at her with his odd, fixed gaze. Somehow, Nadine knew it would not be the last time she'd see him. A reception was held at the house of Nadine's Aunt Carol, her mother's older sister. It was a sumptuous affair, and Nadine stood by the food-laden tables deciding what to eat. Just about everyone who had attended the service was there, except, thankfully, the dark stranger. "Nadine?" asked a heavy-set man with a round, kind face as he approached her with a plate overflowing with food. "My name is Barry Wilder. I was your great-aunt Lucille's attorney." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Wilder," Nadine said politely, extending her hand. She wondered what a lawyer would want with her. "Did you know you were mentioned in your grand-aunt's will?" he asked, taking a bite from an onion roll stuffed with roast beef, lettuce, and mustard. "She wanted you to have something to remember her by." "She did?" Nadine asked with surprise. "I didn't even know her." "Perhaps not, but she certainly knew you," the portly attorney replied, reaching awkwardly into the pocket of his navy blue suit jacket. "Enough that she instructed me upon her death to give you this." Mr. Wilder pulled out a delicate gold chain. Hanging from the chain was a heart-shaped gold locket. "It's beautiful," Nadine explained. "And now it's yours," Mr. Wilder said with a smile as he dropped the locket gently into Nadine's outstretched hand. "I suggest you be very careful with it. It's an heirloom." "Heirloom?" Nadine repeated. "What's that?" A valuable object that's passed down in a family from generation to generation, Mr. Wilder explained. From what your grandaunt told me before her death, that locket has been in your family for almost 300 years. Nadine carefully turned the locket in her hands as she examined it. It was heart-shaped and trimmed with fine, delicate engraving. There was a small clasp on the side of the heart, and when she pressed it, the locket popped open to reveal 2 tiny painted portraits inside. One picture was of a handsome young man, dressed in the elegant style of the early 18th century. The other was of a pretty young woman who looked very much like Nadine? Who's that girl? Nadine asked with surprise. She looks just like me. I know, Mr. Wilder said with a slightly uncomfortable laugh. That's how I managed to recognize you so quickly. There is quite a strong family resemblance. But who is she? Nadine repeated instantly. We could almost be twins. You were great something or other, Mr. Wilder said with a dismissive wave of his hand. The young man on the other side is something of a mystery. Lucille never told me about him. I suspect she never really knew who he was herself. These portraits are obviously several hundred years old. Anyway, she wanted you to have the locket, so my job is done. Enjoy it in good health. I will, Nadine said, snapping the locket closed. And thank you, Mr. Wilder. That night, Nadine lay in her bed staring at the 2 tiny portraits that had shared the gold locket for nearly 3 centuries. I wonder who they were, she said to Diane, who was lying in the next bed. What was their story? Were they brother and sister, husband and wife? Were they lovers? What I want to know is, why did Great Aunt Lucille want you to have it? Diane said. I mean, she didn't even know you. Maybe, said Nadine in a sudden burst of romanticism, this is the key to my destiny. She had no idea how right she was. The next day, while walking to school, her new gold locket displayed proudly around her neck, Nadine had the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. Looking about, she noticed that a dark, late-model car was following her. When she turned to get a better look, she caught only a glimpse of the driver before he sped up and moved on. Although she saw the man for no more than a second or two, she knew it was the mysterious man from the funeral. She saw the stranger again that afternoon when she was walking home. This time, he appeared on the sidewalk just as she turned the corner onto Hammond Street. Startled, Nadine opened her mouth to scream, but the man remained calm and raised a hand for her to be silent. I'm sorry, Miss Barlow. I didn't mean to frighten you, he said in a low voice tinged with a slight Eastern European accent. Nadine took a cautious step backward. Who are you? She demanded, determined not to show the fear that was edging up her spine. Why are you following me? My name is Elliot Frant, the stranger replied in a soft voice. I work for a man who very much wants to meet you. Who's that? Nadine asked suspiciously. His name would have no meaning to you, Mr. Frant said calmly. However, I can assure you he wishes you no harm. In fact, he has an offer for you I think you will find very, very attractive. Have him call my parents, Nadine said. Now get out of my way, I'm going home, unless you want me to start screaming. She stepped around Mr. Frant and prepared to move on, but as she did, the man grabbed her arm firmly. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold chain from which dangled a heart-shaped gold locket. Look familiar? He asked. That looks like my locket, Nadine said with surprise. Indeed, the locket in Mr. Frant's hand appeared to be identical to the one hanging around her neck. She reached out to touch the locket, but Mr. Frant pulled it back teasingly. Look, but don't touch, Mr. Frant said, smiling. Then he began to let the locket swing slowly back and forth. Sunlight glinted off the bright gold casing. Look carefully at the locket. Watch it move left and right, left and right. See how pretty it is. and feel your eyelids growing heavy, heavy, heavy. Trapped by the hypnotic rhythm of Fran's gentle voice, Nadine's eyes slowly closed and her knees buckled. The world around her turned topsy-turvy, and she found herself dropping sleepily toward the sidewalk. If she ever actually hit the concrete, she wasn't awake to feel it. Her head still spinning, Nadine awoke sometime later in what she first thought was some kind of museum. All around her were paintings, statues, and fine mahogany furniture from times long past. But as her vision cleared, she realized that this museum was actually the drawing room of a grand old mansion. There was a fieldstone fireplace at the far end of the room, and in it a fire was blazing. Rising from the plush sofa she had been sleeping on, Nadine glanced out the lead-glass window and saw that night had fallen. She looked at her watch and was surprised to see that several hours had passed. It was now 9:45. "I've got to get out of here," she mumbled, scanning the room for a door. Turning, she was startled to see a young man standing in the doorway, tall, dark-haired, and strikingly handsome. He looked oddly familiar, even though Nadine was sure she'd never seen him before in her life. And then she realized he was a dead ringer for the young man whose picture was in her gold locket. "My word, it is you," he said in awe. "For centuries I prayed for this day to come, but until now I never really thought it possible." "Look, I don't know who you are or what you want, and frankly I don't care," Nadine said, steadying herself against an elegant antique desk. "I just want you to take me home." "But you are home, my darling Ramona," the young man said passionately, "and here we will stay for all eternity." "This isn't my home, and my name isn't Ramona," Nadine said with rising anger. "I'm Nadine Barlow, and I live at 567 Hammond Street. If you don't let me out of here, I'm going to call the police and have you arrested for kidnapping." "You always were a spitfire, my dear," the young man said with a smile. "Even after almost 300 years, you're still as willful as ever. I'm afraid you must have me confused with someone else," said Nadine, trying to stay calm. "Now I'm going to tell you for the last time, take me home." But Nadine's fear was growing by the second. This man obviously believed she was a 300-year-old woman named Ramona, and he wasn't about to change his mind. Crazy people like him couldn't be reasoned with, and they could be very dangerous. Nadine knew that if she didn't get away from him quickly, she might never get away at all. "All right, darling, you may leave," the young man said with a slight bow. "But first, let me tell you who you are." "I know who I am," Nadine stated firmly. The young man raised a hand, signaling for Nadine to remain silent. "You only think you know, but let me explain your true identity. My name is Lord Henry Bates," he said confidently, as if he were teaching a history lesson. "In the year 1711, I came to America from Cornwall, England, to serve as an assistant to the governor of His Majesty's colony of Maryland. While serving in this capacity, I met a beautiful young woman and fell deeply in love with her. The girl, Ramona Quigley, was only 14 at the time, but in those days marriage at that age was not unheard of." Nadine stared at this Lord Bates in disbelief. He was obviously living out some crazy historical fantasy, and she had somehow been drawn into it. Trying to appear calm and attentive, she began to glance casually about the room for something that could serve as a weapon. "We planned to marry on Ramona's 15th birthday, but then she fell ill with a fever," Bates continued, his voice growing sad and distant. "Fearing she would die, I sought the help of an old woman who was rumored to be a powerful healer. She told me Ramona's life could be saved by a transfusion of vampire's blood. Of course, if the treatment was successful, I would still lose her, unless I became a vampire myself. He paused to let what he was saying sink in. It was a heartbreaking decision, he went on solemnly. But my love for Ramona was so strong that I was willing to sacrifice my own immortal soul to spend eternity with her. And so I arranged for both Ramona and myself to become members of the undead. Nadine's eyes now came to rest on Bates, whose sadness and pain seemed uncomfortably real. Despite herself, she was actually beginning to feel sorry for this tortured man. Not only that, but somehow she was beginning to sense that his story, as far-fetched as it sounded, could be the truth. So what you're telling me is that you and Ramona actually became vampires? Nadine asked, afraid of his answer. Bates sighed painfully. Unfortunately, no. The dual transfusion took place precisely at midnight as the old witch had instructed, he said. But something went wrong. While I smoothly made the transition from mortal to vampire, my dear Ramona, well, she died instantly. Perhaps she was already too far gone and the shock of the transfusion was simply too great. He shook his head. I'll never really know, but one thing I did know was that I couldn't live without her. And now that I could never die, I wouldn't even enjoy her in death. I was doomed to walk the earth alone for all eternity. Bates stepped closer to Nadine, looked deep into her eyes, then took the locket out of her throat in his hand and held it gently. This locket, the symbol of our undying love, was given to her younger sister, who in turn passed it down to her daughters years later, Bates explained. I have followed its progress over the centuries in the belief, the hope, that its power would someday bring my dearest Ramona back to me. And now, at long last, I see that it has. He stared into Nadine's eyes with a look so powerful that she nearly fainted. You think I'm Ramona? She managed to stammer. But I'm not. I know that you are, he said. I can see it in your eyes, and I can feel it in my soul. Look deep into your heart, and you will know I speak the truth. In fact, Nadine was feeling a strong, almost overwhelming attraction to this man. But her rational mind continued to insist that both he and this situation were totally insane. Now that I found you, I will never lose you again. Bates went on, his voice powerful. The time has come for you to join me in immortality. He opened his mouth to reveal 2 long fangs. His eyes blazed red as he lowered his mouth toward Nadine's neck. No! Nadine screamed, somehow managing to break away from Bates and run. She sprinted toward the door, but he suddenly appeared in front of her and grabbed her by the arm. You're mine, Ramona, he bellowed, and I am yours, forever and for all time. Again, his fangs came down swiftly toward her neck, but at the same time she raised her foot and slammed it forcefully into the vampire's kneecap. Bates gave a painful howl and lost his grip on her. Grabbing a nearby vase, Nadine swung it into Bates' chest. The blow took the vampire by surprise, and the impact sent him stumbling backward into the roaring fire in the huge stone fireplace. Ramona, no! Bates screamed as flames danced around him. Looking on in horror, Nadine watched as the vampire thrashed about madly for several moments, then vanished, leaving no sign that there had ever been a Lord Henry Bates, not even ashes. You have killed my master, came a voice from behind her. Nadine spun around to find Elliot standing in the doorway. She gasped in fear. What would he do to her? Kill her? I don't know how to thank you, Fran said. Bates held me in his power and forced me to do his bidding for the last 15 years. Thanks to you, I'm free at last. If there's anything I can do. Take me home, Nadine said immediately. I'll tell my folks I went to the library and fell asleep. No one has to know about any of this. Weeks later, after much searching, Nadine located an old book on American colonial history at the town library. It indicated that a man named Lord Henry Bates had served in the government of colonial Maryland in the early 18th century. So at least that much of Bates's story had been true. But much to her disappointment, there was no mention of what happened to him after that. Nadine continued to wear the heart-shaped locket containing the pictures of Bates and his love, Ramona. As time passed, she became more and more convinced that Bates' story had been true, and that she was the reincarnation of this dead girl's spirit. She began to wonder if she and Bates could have made a life together. She even daydreamed about what life would have been like as a vampire. This thought was on her mind when, 2 years later, she attended the funeral of her Uncle Albert, who had died following a long illness. She and her parents were returning to their car when she noticed a man staring at them from a row of nearby headstones. Like most of the mourners, he was dressed in dark clothes. He also wore a dark blue scarf over his face, even though the temperature was well above 50 degrees. Looking at the man, Nadine believed she saw the reason for the scarf. His face looked scarred and blistered, as if he had survived a horrendous fire. Continuing to study the man, Nadine fixed on his eyes. They looked shockingly familiar. Nadine gasped suddenly as recognition dawned. Deep, dark, and filled with longing, the eyes staring back at her belonged to Lord Henry Bates.